we were just driving along, and all of a sudden, and all of a sudden moment, we went into a skid, and the car rolled over a number of times, and I remember coming to a stop, but I couldn't move.
Hey guys, welcome back to our second episode with Pastor Garett, and we are interviewing Pastor Warner. If you didn't see the first episode, go ahead and do that. We'll wait for you. And we're going to jump right back into this. We're going to be talking about discipleship, church planting, a bunch of good stuff. So let's get started.
Yeah, last week we left off with you at the house of Miss Burgess, the one that we're all going to thank when we get to heaven. You know, there's a lot of people you want to visit when you get to heaven.
It's the big mansion on the horizon.
She's one of them that we're going to be all thanking for her investment in your life. But let's move forward the conversation to really, though that was the beginnings of your discipleship, really your interaction with Pastor Warner, with Pastor Mitchell, amongst the other disciples in the context of the church and your discipleship. The idea of church planting is so familiar to many of us, but it wasn't back then. I don't think it was. It didn't happen yet in that sense in our fellowship as it was forming. So how did you see that developing, and what took place from Miss Burgess' house to that kind of context there?
Well, if you're going to talk about church planting, you have to back up. And you have to begin with evangelism and conversion, which is followed by discipleship. And discipleship is simply a committed follower of Jesus Christ. And so, and then the outgrowth of that was church planting. But back in those days, it wasn't that we talked about church planting all the time. It was not an idea that we had been introduced to yet. But what we were involved in was just living our lives for Christ, loving the church, loving people. And so we were outreaching in different ways all the time. You had the beginning of the music ministry in Prescott, which was a building that they called The Door. The reason our church today is called Door Church is because back then, the outreach concert ministry of the Prescott Foursquare Church was The Door. And so there were concerts every Friday, every Saturday night. And so you had, along with Eden, that eventually all of the members of that music group got saved, came into the church. They would play. There were other groups. And then young men who were growing in God and faithfully serving in the church were given opportunities to preach and to give altar calls in that concert environment. We would do concerts in other cities where we would travel. The music group and other members of the church would travel. And again, young men were given the opportunity to preach and to express what Christ had done in their lives. And so this was the environment. This was the climate that we were raised with. And so did Pastor Mitchell have this grand scheme and have everything thought out? That yes, we're going to reach into what are we looking at today? 150 plus nations. Did he have this? No, he didn't. This was something that God was doing. And this is why in the last probably 7 years of his life, he would say so often, over and over, that this was not something we put together. This was something that God did.
Yes.
And so, but feeding that was his own conviction, having given his life to Christ, having gone to Bible college, and then I think there was 5 other churches, cities, where he and Sister Mitchell had moved their family and pastored in. There grew in him a conviction that, hey, why are we taking some of the promising young men and women, and why are we sending them off to Bible school? Because he'd seen it over and over that they would go off to Bible school disconnected from the local church, and some never to return again. And so that pretty much of a failed pattern he had seen, and he had a conviction that there was a better way. One of the books that we read, and it did shape his thinking, was Robert Coleman's The Master Plan of Evangelism, where he talks about discipleship as the natural extension of that. And so Pastor Mitchell's vision is that these men could be discipled within the context of a local church, and then out of that, the natural extension is that they could be discipled and equipped and then sent by a local church into another city to reproduce what God had done in their mother church, which for me is the Potter's House in Prescott. Then it was the Prescott Foursquare Gospel Church. But that was behind it all. Those convictions had developed in his own heart and life, that you could see men grow, develop, and still maintain that connection with the local church. And they could maintain that connection even if they were in another city, because, wait a minute, I'm not a self-made man. I was sent.
Yes.
And that is a very important Bible word. How shall they preach except they be sent? And so those were things that Pastor Mitchell held in his heart and mind. They were the shaping influences that gave birth to the idea and then the vision that we could do that within the context of that church and those many young people who had come to Christ.
So when this was formulating in his heart, all of these things coming together in his mind as the Spirit of God is working on him, giving him this strategy, when did he first express it to you personally, or was it over the pulpit? Because you were the first one sent out, I believe.
Yeah, I was the first lab rat.
So he obviously had to come to you and say something, or say something over the pulpit, ask for volunteers. How did that transpire?
Well, there was preaching over the pulpit, communicating that vision, and that, hey, this is a possibility for our church. This is where God is leading us. So again, this really was an evolution in his mind and thinking, because if you have this growing group of young men contending to want to preach the gospel, serve God with their time, treasures, and talents that you had to do something with them. You couldn't just simply let them hang out. You had to, and so he, over the pulpit, began to present that vision, and then just in the normal flow of life, communicate that this was a real possibility. And so, as a whole, there were many young men like myself that seed was planted that, you know what, this is something that could involve my life. And then you have the personal element, which is someone experiencing and feeling the call of God in their lives to want to preach the gospel. So this isn't just simply randomly choosing whoever. These were people who expressed a genuine desire to want to preach the gospel. And so the discipleship arena of our preparation was simply watching my pastor, what he did. He was a man of the Word of God. He was a man of the book. That then, it became natural. I would want to know, what are you reading? There were other times I would. And this wasn't like happening every day, but during this period, I had opportunity to go to his library, just check out. That's why my office mirrors his.
Messy desk and all.
In a very uncanny way. But this possibility, because that's what it was at the time. It's, today there are flags, here's church planning, but no, at the time, this was a possibility, and this was the natural outflow, and we were, he had expressed this at Foursquare conventions, whether it was the International Conference or what was then called the Southwest District, this vision that, we can disciple these young men and they have a place in God's economy where they can do something for God.
Yeah, so let's introduce somebody into the story who we kind of haven't yet. We haven't. Local girl, Mona Pena. You marry her, okay?
Yes.
And you guys are newlyweds, and so you have this opportunity now, and what we look back as the first pioneering venture, right? But it all boils down to one afternoon. Can you tell us how that story started, how it went?
Okay, we're talking about
Kearney.
Okay, so
how did Kearney come about?
Mona and I, when we got married, she is Mexican from the barrio in Prescott, which the barrio in Prescott is a very small little area on Vallejo Street, which was unpaved road at the time. And so when we were married, our experience had been we were serving God together in the context of the church there. We were involved in various aspects of the life of the church, but the opportunity to actually now transition, and we're going to put this into practice in a real way, which involved a little town in Kearney, Arizona, which is a copper mining town. It's northeast of Tucson here, would have been southwest, I believe, southeast from Prescott. But there was a man in Kearney, his name was Walt Odom. He was a jeweler. He ran a jewelry store, was a Christian, And the Jesus movement, again, had a very broad reach, and it reached into this little town of Kearney. And so they have a Bible study, and with a lot of young people that are starting to come to it. And somehow he had heard about Pastor Mitchell, the church in Prescott, so he called Pastor Mitchell, and in that conversation, Walt Odom brought up the idea of we need a pastor, and the idea of pioneering a church. Whether that was the terminology he used, I'm not sure. But in that conversation, and Pastor Mitchell related this to me, because if this opportunity was going to involve Mona and I, he wanted me to know how it came about. And in that conversation, he was very specific. And that is, he said, so you are asking for a pastor. Is that right? And yes, we want a pastor. And he would ask him again, so you're sure you want a pastor? Yes, we want a pastor. And so out of that, because Pastor Mitchell tried to clarify those things, and he expressed that this was their desire, then he came to me and told me about the conversation, told me about the opportunity, which then resulted in me going down there to spy out the land, to go there personally. And so we went. We arrived on a Friday. It was Ron Jones and myself. We stayed in a local hotel there. The next day, we didn't know this, they were having the Copper Days parade in Kearney, which in a little town, they have their annual celebration, different names, different historical reasons, but the Copper Days parade was a big thing for a little town. And so, we think sometimes very differently than the normal person. A normal person, when they hear the word parade, think of marching bands and horse-drawn buggies or other floats and features. But we thought, parade, what a great evangelism opportunity. And so we just arrived. I'd met Walt and his wife. We hear about this parade taking place the next day. And so Ron and I did what we always do. We thought, here's an outreach opportunity. We got one of the little portable PA systems that looked like an attaché case, had a microphone, and the parade route, the last vehicle was the police car, which usually ends the parade, as we got right behind them and marched in the parade, preaching throughout the parade route, giving our testimonies and the like. And that was our first outreach in Kearney, Arizona. And I don't know how far you want me to go with this, Gabe.
Well, what happened that afternoon? Like, how did this?
Well, it is very vivid in my mind that the parade route went through some different streets, but it ended in the city square, in the town square. And I remember coming into the town square, and we had been preaching along the route. We entered into the square, and not sure how many feet, probably 150 feet away was Walt Odom's jewelry store. And I remember him standing in the door of his shop, and our eyes met, and it was almost like I just knew that we're going to have problems. That this wasn't, Ron and I thought this was a fantastic opportunity. Look at this, but our eyes met, and he wasn't thinking the same way at all. And so this would have been Saturday afternoon. And out of that, they decided, even though Pastor Mitchell, very clear, you want a pastor? Yes, we want a pastor. They decided, no, maybe we don't want a pastor.
Not that kind of pastor.
Not that kind. Not somebody who would be disruptive or somehow seem to give a bad image. All we were doing was what Christ said, which was preaching the gospel. The police car was there. They didn't shut us down. They weren't moved or upset. There are a lot of background issues that I found out later that, and I don't want to poke a bear, but he was a Mason.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of image issues involved. And so I ended up, because where they met was in his home. Do you want a pastor means you would have to give up some, quote, control and let somebody else begin to lead. And I'm 20, quick math, 24 years old. And so I'm going to turn this over to a 24-year-old kid who just the day before had been making the gospel a public display. And so I did preach in their home Sunday following, but the communication was, we changed our mind and we really think we should just remain a Bible study and all the other elements of what a church would be. No, I don't know if we want to really embrace those. So they did a reverse move in their thinking and what they had communicated.
You got rejected.
Yeah, it's called.
You got rejected.
Yeah, you failed the interview.
Yeah.
This was your opportunity for the big break,
Yep.
and you sat down in your interview and you totally blew it.
And so as you're okay, now we got to go back to Prescott and we got to tell Pastor Mitchell they don't really want us. What's your conversation with Ron Jones like?
How do you tell them that Christian Fellowship Ministries never started, never existed?
Yeah. It wasn't a lengthy major phone call, but it was, Pastor Mitchell, they're not going for this. They're not going to accept us. Right. And so I don't see any future in trying to try to assert myself and insert myself into a situation where we were not welcomed.
Right.
Even though that was what originally initiated it all. So the phone call was simply, this is not going to work. They're not going to accept this, which means the following day, Monday, I'd have to go back to Prescott. And so I didn't have deep thoughts about my future. It was, this didn't work. And so, we still have our apartment. We still have our little house in Prescott. And so I'm going to have to go back.
Not to take this too far, but didn't the Apostle Paul have issues with some jewelry guys? Emphasis on entrenched interests?
The silversmiths, yes. There is, and I hadn't thought about that, but that is a very interesting connection.
So Monday morning, you get in your car with Ron Jones.
Yep.
and you start heading back to Prescott. You're talking conversation. Is it silent? What's going on?
No,
And then take us from there.
It was, okay, this didn't work out, but not everything is going to work out in life. And so we have a mother church. We're just going to go back. And so we loaded everything up. At the time, I owned a Dodge Colt. I don't think they even make them anymore, but they
still have horses.
Yeah, yeah. And so that morning, we just packed up and started to drive back to Prescott.
And what happened?
And then everything in life changed in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
And that's why I actually, we'll have to debate and come up with maybe the best title, but my idea of 3, 2, 1, 3 seconds that can change your life. We were on a slightly outside of Kearney. There had been a light rain that morning, and there was a stretch of highway that had been, they had put fresh asphalt down. And so the rain plus the oil that was in the freshly laid asphalt, and being 24 and not a car guy, they weren't bald tires. They were they were used, let's say. And so we were just driving along, and all of a sudden, and it was an all of a sudden moment, we went into a skid on that road, and the car, the rear end started moving to the right. We went into a skid, and on the side there was an embankment. Had to have been, 10 to 20 feet. And so we hit the side of the road in that embankment, and the car rolled over a number of times. I remember, and it was a split second. And I remember coming to a stop. And the first thing, there was the thought in my mind, I'm going to go to be with Jesus, a fleeting thought. And we come to a stop. The first thing you do is, am I alive?
Yeah.
And I remember Ron quickly jumped out of the car, and it was like I can still hear him getting out of the car. Oh, Jesus, oh, Jesus, Lord, help us. And so I couldn't move. And so I didn't know what had happened. Looking back, what took place is that the car roof rolling over had come down, and compression had driven me into the seat, and my L1 vertebrae had broken there, a compression fracture, but I couldn't move. And so I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. And so I'm in the process of sitting there trying to hold myself up while Ron ran up the embankment, flagged down a car, and they were able to call 911. The ambulance came. So, I still had, dirt and dust. You know what the desert's like. It doesn't take much to stir up that. I could taste that in my mouth. The ambulance arrived. They put me on a backboard, and from there transported me to the little hospital in Kearney, where, it was very obvious they were not equipped to treat this serious of an injury. And so they made the decision, I'm sure there were phone calls made, to transport me to Phoenix. And this would have been Monday, April 30th, 1973, where I was transported. Ron was in the ambulance with me. He said they had given me medication, so I was I was feeling all right. But they transported me to Barrows Neurological Center in Phoenix. And that night, they performed a laminectomy, which is where they fused together the vertebrae that had been broken. And so calls were made. Pastor Mitchell was notified. He drove down. They got word to Mona, who was at work that day, that there's been an accident. Harold's in the hospital. So sometime later that day into the early evening, she would have come as well. And, it's just a hospital. This isn't TV, but this was a hospital emergency room. And, I still, I'm lying there. I could still have and taste, like I said, the dirt in my mouth from the accident. But then, the surgery and then recovery, and then you're put in, I was in the ICU that night. And
did they tell you at some point you'll never walk again, or did they say you have a possibility?
Yeah, they don't, maybe they do nowadays. They don't completely spill the beans.
Right.
What had happened, again, a compression fracture of my L1 vertebrae and severed my spinal cord in that fracture. But no, they didn't start. They didn't lead with. And I actually, I'm not projecting decades into the future in that moment. Anyhow, I'm pretty focused on what just happened. How do I get through the night? I remember the one thing I remember. And I was probably pretty drugged up in ICU, as a guy nearby had a traumatic brain injury. And so I guess to stimulate his brain or something, his television was on very loud enough to disturb me, where I probably didn't have the greatest of Christian graces at the time, like, turn that down, or I might have expressed it differently, but it was pretty much of a whirlwind situation.
What do you remember about your first conversation with Mona?
Well, she came down, they let her into the emergency room, and it was basically just her being there for me. She didn't, they didn't tell her the details, except that, he had the accident, he broke his back, and, we're going to have to do surgery on him. So it was, it wasn't a discussion about the big things in life. It was just like any husband and wife, her presence, just being there.
Yep, glad you're alive. We're together.
Yeah, and so there was no deep. It was just that comforting presence.
What do you remember about your first conversation with Pastor Mitchell when he came to visit you?
Yeah, Pastor Mitchell is not. It wasn't stoic. It was, but it was hopeful, and that is, God is in control, and we're going to be praying. And so in those first conversations, we didn't even because it wasn't at the forefront. It was about, hey, you have to get better, and God's in control. And so it was a hope filled for a faith-filled conversation.
And so, I've known you for my whole life. I know that every circumstance you're in, and I imagine it was back then and still as it is today, but you find a way to minister. You don't care. You're just going to minister. That's who you are. What was your ministry like in that hospital? You no doubt created opportunities.
Yeah. I kind of, it just came to my mind, Joseph's story, and how that Joseph is thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery into Egypt. He's in Potiphar's house, and he served there. He's set up, lied about, thrown into jail, and he served there. And so you're right. It's in the DNA of any committed Christian that no matter what circumstance you're in, you're going to try to serve. So I remember it was during that time that lots of people would visit Larry Reed, who lived in Phoenix at the time. He visited me on more than one occasion. And again, these weren't long, let's bare our soul conversations. It was, Larry's deep roar of a voice and Brother Harold and, and the devil is a liar and all of that. But, I would just simply in normal conversation talk about the hope that I had in Christ. Would, whether nurses or aspects of physical therapy, etc., make that known. The one memorable ministry opportunity is Larry Reed had a radio program on the Christian radio station in Phoenix. I'm not sure what the call letters or numbers were, but he was going out of town, couldn't do that, and asked me to fill in for that period of time on his radio show. And so we had and some of you can Google this, but we had a tape deck back then, and I had a microphone. And so the first almost 10 weeks, this was before nowadays you're in the hospital and they get you out right away or as soon as possible. Sometimes I think too soon, but knowing what I do today about hospital-borne infections, I don't think I preceded a lot of that, I'm sure, but they kept you in the hospital until you were well. And so because of the laminectomy, I couldn't sit up. I had to lie prone for nearly 10 weeks. And so I would lie on the stretcher, and I'd have I'd be on my stomach. I'd have in front of me the tape deck. I'd have the microphone, and I guess it would be interesting research to see if there's ever a record of any of that. But I would preach and I would testify on these tapes. They were given to the radio station, and so when Larry Reed's program came on, it was me pre-recorded from my stretcher. And at the time, I was in Good Samaritan Hospital in their spinal cord injury, their SCI rehab center. The one thing, just maybe to put in, that because there was so much divine orchestration when I was first saved, the timing of all of this, even though life had drastically changed in ways that I couldn't comprehend yet. I had my accident on Monday, April 30th. The next day, May 1st, the Good Samaritan Hospital received a government grant for their spinal cord injury rehab facility. And I was the first or one of the first people to be admitted. So this would be May 1st or May 2nd, admitted into that facility where I stayed for almost 3 months. And the entire thing was footed by the grant that they had received. So for a young couple who didn't have health insurance and all of those other things, to not have to worry, not have to think about finances was a huge burden that was lifted. So I focused on, all right, how am I going to get well? How am I going to, I had a strong belief, and that belief still exists today, that God is a healer. Mm-hmm. He is Jehovah Rapha, and so he is by his very nature a miracle worker. And so I held on to that. I had people pray for me. I prayed for myself. I remember when the doctors would make their rounds. It would be the head doctor, bunch of residents and others, and they came into the room. And, here I am. I'm trying to believe God. He's a miracle worker. But this, it was like this cloud of unbelief. It was also reality came into the room. And so I'm, testifying that I know a God who's a miracle worker, but at the same time, I also realize that, hey, this is, when you sever your spinal cord, this is what's called permanent. And so there was a decision made, numerous decisions, that my focus is going to be, how do I get on with life? How do I heal, learn whatever I need to learn? How do I get out of here to go on with life?
Can you speak to that, the new reality where you started your marriage standing up? Now you had this conversation with your doctors, you've had this conversation with your wife, and, be still and know that I am God. When I'm still, sometimes it's the biggest wars break out. And what was going on inside your head, knowing that we may never have children? You have a father's heart. Mona's been a surrogate mother to a lot of us. How did you process that?
Yeah, it didn't, and some of those things, they probably are going to be best suited to write about as opposed to just a podcast. But, a lot of this is that I was young, mm-hmm. and when people, and I understand why they ask the questions. I remember being in El Paso at a serious men's class early Sunday morning before the morning service, and they asked me about my accident. And, I really have to say that it wasn't because, I was filled with faith and power, and nothing's too hard for God, which is true. But some of it is I was young, and being young, I was naive.
Yeah.
So I'm actually grateful that when this happened was when I was young and naive. If it had been me as a 45-year-old man with a knowledge of life, I probably would not have responded as well. So there's a huge naive factor, and that is I wasn't thinking years into the future.
Right.
Just because of my circumstances, I was forced to really focus on the here and now. And so some of those bigger questions, they didn't necessarily come into play because I was still the same person. I just couldn't walk. So nothing had changed there. Nothing had changed in my relationship with God. And there is the reality of wedding vows. And there's a reason why we, hold to what's called the traditional wedding vows. Not I promise to love you as long as love shall last, but, do you promise for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health? And that's those vows are not unbelief. It's just saying, there's an uncertainty to all of life, and these vows create an island of certainty in an ocean of uncertainty. And so we didn't, some of the big questions weren't, immediately analyzed and put under the microscope. The focus was, how do we continue? She still had her job. We still had a place to live, but it was really adapting to a new reality. And in the process of time, I had a doctor tell me fairly recently, who'd never met me before in my life, but understood trauma and understood me without ever knowing me. And he said to me, your whole life has been about trying to normalize what is abnormal. And so what he's referring to is just the fact of life, that, life is, there are no guarantees. Life is a full contact sport. And I had just been injured. And so how do I adapt? How do we, my wife and I, normalize? So when they talk about the new normal, hey, I've been living that long before it was popular. And part of pop culture jargon is that there's something in your spirit that you really do labor. Okay, how do I normalize then this situation? And in my mind, it was so that I can still do the will of God.
I think that's critical. And we're going to get into the trauma elements a little bit more in an upcoming episode. I think that one of the things you mentioned there that's very key is you had and others focused even in the midst of your own crisis. And in other words, you had stuff to do that was bringing ministry to others. It wasn't all about you. It wasn't all about what you're going through. And so many times when we go through traumatic experiences in life, you are left to your own thoughts. You're left to your own self sometimes. And that can be destructive. That when you have an opportunity to minister, it's like water on a dry soul. It brings healing to you when you're reaching out. And in that hospital, God provided not just financially for you, but he provided opportunities for you to come outside of yourself, outside of your new reality, that this wasn't something you had to dwell on as much as, wait a minute, okay, now how do I still minister? I can still minister. I can still talk to people. I can still tell people about Jesus. And there was an outward focus that seems to be such a key in times like this.
Yeah, and that is the essence of what a real Christian is. In 2 Corinthians 5, it says that we should no longer live unto ourselves, but unto him who loved us and died for us. So Christianity, Discipleship 101, Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you must deny yourself, which is not popular, never has been. You must take up your cross and follow me. So taking up your cross is not, a burden. This is my cross to bear. Taking up your cross was your life is going to be identified with me and my redemptive mission and purpose. And so that is a very real element, that though my physical conditions had been, in a matter of seconds, really radically and forever changed, who I was, and especially who I was in God, hadn't changed one iota. So I'm adapting to, everyday challenges in a new way. But over here is the reality of who I am in Christ, and that is a constant. It didn't waver. And these were times it really did blow my mind, that I actually had to think, is there something wrong with me? Because that was such a constant.
Yes.
Where everything else was, up in the air and turmoil and uncertainty, this didn't change at all. That mentality of, what does God have for my life? How am I going to pursue that? And so one of the things, there's two aspects to therapy when you're a spinal cord injury patient. One is physical therapy. That's all the things related to, learning to live life in a wheelchair, all the other things. But there's occupational therapy,
right?
Which, you can read about that. Some of it was silly. I'm a grown man making leather wallets if this is going to. But I did, in that time, sense. And it was God's grace, but I did communicate that, God still had a plan and a purpose for me, which was to preach the gospel.
Yeah, and I want to wrap this episode up right here, because as we look at next week, looking ahead, I want us to contemplate and retell the story of what I call the master class in leadership that Pastor Mitchell, his response to this and the obvious questions about, well, wait a minute, here we are starting church planting, and this is the first thing that happens. God doesn't want us to do this. That's one response. And then the other response, the devil's a lie. There's all this stuff, and Pastor Mitchell processing that. And I want to hear from you on the next episode about that. We're going to start talking about that. And then we're going to start talking in our next episode about how Tucson came about and how long it took you to get from the hospital to Tucson, which was a very short amount of time. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about the Tucson church, and we're going to reflect on 50 years of ministry here in Tucson, and just from your perspective of how God moved things. So, Gabe, why don't you go ahead and take us out of this episode today?
All right, next week we're coming back to Tucson. Remember to like and subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and if somebody doesn't know about these episodes, let them know. We will see you next week. God bless.